what we can see in the European Union is that cities and towns have become more important over time. When you look back in the late 1980s, there was nothing. There was really no connection between the EU Commission or the EU institutions and cities and or the local level, because cities are part of the nation states, of the member states, and there is no legal combination or a legal relation between these two levels. So that has changed a lot. And but in most member states, climate policy, and that's climate mitigation, but also climate adaptation, is still voluntary. There are some exceptions. France, for example, you have to do it. The city has a certain size, but in general, it's voluntary, which brings many problems, because if you have a financial crisis, who can do a climate policy? Maybe Munich can or Zurich can, but smaller cities cannot do that anymore. Then what we also see when you look at the research on cities, also an EU project, it's mainly the forerunners. So when you look over research over time, or also funding over time, the big and large forerunner cities, they got funding, and they are also in the middle of the research. So it's not a smaller city, it's not a laggard. Nobody does research on laggard, but it would be necessary to do that. So there is a research gap here. And I mean, that's something which you can see, which will be a red line also, that most cities are not forerunners. Most cities are smaller cities. Most people live in cities below 100,000 inhabitants. And we have to look for different pathways. So Zurich or Freiburg, green city of Freiburg, that's not a model for the rest of German cities. I will come back to that later. It's also not a model for all European cities. I will go back a little bit in history. So the whole process started already with the Rio Conference in '92, a long time ago. But we had a local Agenda 21. Some of you may still remember, many probably not. In Europe, we had the Aalborg Charta, which was also then the European Cities and Towns campaign, which was almost as big as the Covenant of Mayors is today, with a very similar structure. So it was strongest in Spain and in Italy, which you also see nowadays with the Covenant. And the countries we started first were Sweden, Netherlands, the UK. Germany was much later due to the federalist structure of the country, but it was the country where you had 2,500 local Agenda 21 processes over time, over 10 years. So there was a lot of things were going on already at that time, which is important because you see some kind of a path dependency over time. So the forerunners are forerunners today. So cities come back to German cities because I know them best, but also cities like Copenhagen, Stockholm. They signed the Aalborg Charta first. It was also Heidelberg, Freiburg were among the founders. And in the late 80s, in the early 1990s, the transnational city network started. Some of the cities might be, your cities might be. Munich is for sure, that's what I know. It's for Euros, it's a member of Eurocities. Others might be as well. Eurocities was founded as a network of second cities. So that was a city like Frankfurt, which is not capital city. So they were most important when it came to the founding of Eurocities. Then the Union of the Baltic Cities came up in '91 as a bottom-up initiative by Gdansk in Poland and Kalmar in Sweden. So that was very early on. After the wall came down, they wanted to work together, and basically 100 cities around the Baltic Sea. So you have these more or less very generalized general networks, but you got also the specialized networks. So ICLEI was founded already before the Rio Conference, influenced the Rio Conference, and had a Cities for Climate campaign, which was also important, at least at that time, with national chapters. Finland, it was very strong in Italy, I think also in the UK. And the Climate Alliance is interesting network because it's very strong in continental Europe, Germany, Austria. It was strong in the Netherlands, but the Dutch chapter left due to some financial issues. The reason why it is just in continental Europe is the language. It's an international, transnational networks which cooperates with the indigenous peoples in the Amazon region. So that was the early idea. But today it's more, most members are in Germany, Austria, Southern Tyrol, and Italy. So all these German-speaking regions. Energy Cité, nowadays it's called Energy Cities, is the third one. So we had these three networks. Most of them also had national networks or subnational networks. And we worked on that already 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And at that time, these networks were networks founded by forerunners, forerunners. And it was criticized for that for a long time. So in recent years, because there's a covenant of mayors, that's not for forerunners, of course not. But at that time, it was for the forerunners. And I would also argue that each network, when it starts, it's a network for forerunners. That's pretty clear. So you cannot criticize that. But when you look at the Network Climate Alliance has more than 1,000 members. So some of them are pretty big. Here you can see the effect of the Climate Alliance. That's the red line. That's for Germany. So that is development of Climate Alliance membership in Germany. And you can see there was a take-up in the 1990s, and many cities joined at that time. We have data here for 104 cities. That's all bigger cities, all cities above 100,000 inhabitants, and 103 already had a climate action plan or climate change strategy, mitigation strategy in 2018. We also made an update. So nowadays, all of them have one, but you can see some kind of a time lag with the blue line. But in most cities, the Climate Alliance initiated the development of climate policy. That's for sure, at least for Germany. And what you also can see is a new uptake, start of KLL funding. That's a Kommunalrichtlinie. So that's a German funding program. And when it started in 2008, and that changed the situation because nowadays it's more the funding which makes a difference. So the rest of the cities which did not join the Climate Alliance until 2008, they became funding from the national government, and then they started. So for the latecomers and laggards, it was important to have this funding program. Also, all the big cities and rich cities, they also took money, and probably even more than the latecomers and laggards. And look at the different phases of EU city relationship, and the transnational and municipal networks are the first phase. And then a second phase, you can see the Covenant of Mayors, and that was intended to implement the 2008 climate and energy package of the EU. So it was some kind of a program to support this. The Covenant of Mayors office was always run by a consortium of city networks, like the Climate Alliance. Energy Cities is leading there. So that was a consortium from the very beginning. So these networks still played a role, or still play a role, with the Covenant of Mayors. And there's the whole history. So that first it was the Covenant of Mayors just for climate mitigation, then there was climate adaptation was added, then there was a merger. So nowadays, there was first a merger between mitigation and adaptation, and then with the Compact of Mayors. So the Covenant of Mayors became global over time. But most of the signatories are still in the member states. So that's about 10,000 signatories. There are not many joining, but it was also a first period until 2020 is most important, because then you got this reduction, climate CO2 reductions, emission reductions, which the cities committed to. It's also supported by covenant coordinators, so that are regional authorities like German states or Italian provinces. And we also have the covenant supporters. Supporters can be all kinds of municipal networks or energy agencies, whatever. So that's also important. I would like to say that the regions are extremely important also for the Covenant of Mayors, because they support the Covenant of Mayors. You can see that in Catalonia, for example. So that was very important. It's not just Barcelona, it's also the whole region. You can also see that most signatories are in Italy and in Spain. So it's almost 75% or so are in Italy and Spain. When you look at the German situation, German cities, they don't have to join because they have this national subsidy program, and that's for them easier. In Italy and Spain, the situation is different. And then there are countries like Belgium. In Belgium, you get more national money when you sign the Covenant of Mayors. So the Belgian cities, they have an incentive to join the covenant. So in Belgium, it's also very high. And it's a similar situation was in Italy. And in a third phase, so there was first the Pact of Amsterdam, and that was a multi-level partnership idea with 12 priority areas. Some of them also relate to energy and climate adaptation, energy transition. It's important because it was for the first time that the member states came in again. Because the Covenant of Mayors was an interaction between the EU and the Commission and the Covenant of Mayors office and the transnational city networks on the one side and the cities on the other. And they left out the member states. They even bypassed the member states, which is also a problem when you have national subsidy programs or whatsoever. And the Pact of Amsterdam included the member states, also subnational units and authorities. And the latest development are the EU missions. On the one hand, for mitigation, so the climate neutral and smart cities, the full name, and also for climate adaptation. And many forerunner cities joined or they became one of these 100 cities, which were selected. So there were almost 400 cities applied, and 100 cities were selected. 100 in the EU member states and another 12 in non-member states. And now we have 10 cities already got the EU mission label, so they have a contract with the EU. So that's the newest development, is to come up with these contracts, and you can see some cities, Mannheim, Sunderberg in Denmark, and also Vitoria-Gasteiz, Zaragoza, Spanish city, Klagenfurt. So some of these cities already made a contract with the EU, and that includes also investment plans. So that's one of the main ideas here also, to attract private investors for infrastructure projects. And of course, you can say, will it really work? Will the European cities become climate neutral? I had an interesting talk some time ago with the vice mayor or the climate mayor of Heidelberg, who said we need that because it's important. We have to go in this direction, but we will not reach. But Heidelberg is one of these 100 cities. So it really depends also on the circumstances and on the context. I would say that the Nordic cities are forerunners. Copenhagen is well known, Stockholm, also Lahti in Finland. So there are a couple of cities which are far ahead. I also did a study on Turku in Finland. I think they want to be climate neutral in 29. They are on a good way, but the Nordic cities are in a different situation than Dutch cities or German cities, which depend very much on fossil fuels and have a huge problem. The context is very important here. And you have this development from the covenant, which is open to all cities, to this EU emissions, which is more for forerunner cities. And now the question is, of course, how does that correspond to each other? How do you combine that you have 10,000 cities which have committed at least to the goals of the Covenant of Mayors, and then you have these 100 mission cities, and now you have also pilot cities, twin cities, so there are additional programs now coming up, but it's still a question, how do they complement each other or not? I mean, we had similar situations in Germany. It's this general funding program of the Kommunalrichtlinie and then forerunner program. Do they really work? Because the main idea also at the EU level is that you have these lighthouses and then you get followers anymore, and then they replicate everything. So it has changed over time, but at the beginning that was a very naive picture, at least from a political science perspective, because you have the forerunners, the lighthouses, they have the capacities, but smaller cities cannot follow. They need national funding, they need regional funding, they need EU funding, they need more capacities. So they cannot just follow, as I said earlier, Freiburg or Munich. And one of the most important questions is scaling. I will come back to the issue of scaling later on. Then just a couple of short, more introductory notes. What kind of policy instruments can you use in climate policy, and what is used in climate policy? And that's you can use that at all levels. So the EU also has regulatory policy like car standards, and they are important for cities because they cannot change anything. Similarly, you have national laws for traffic or transport, which also can hinder climate policy at a local level. That we have done that for the Netherlands, but also in Germany, you can see that in mobility transition is almost impossible if you have national laws, which we have right now in Germany. So the regulation can be done at these different levels, and also cities can use regulatory policies or regulatory instruments, but most of them don't do that. So because it might cause conflicts, and I mean, if you say, okay, now you have to connect to district heating or whatsoever, people maybe they don't want it because they already have a heat pump. It really depends. So the regulatory policies are not used so often as they should be used. Economic financial instruments, that really depends. It's carbon trading at the EU level, but you can also have parking fees at the local level, so that these economic instruments, they can be positive or negative, but they are important. Positive is more the subsidies. I talked about that before. So that is frequently used also at the local level, if a city is rich enough, you can also fund a solar roof or something like that and have a local program. Then we have voluntary instruments, agreements. I mentioned contracts or climate contracts. They were actually developed in Sweden. There's a program which is called Viable Cities. And I think 23 cities in Sweden, they have contracts with the national agencies. So that's voluntary on the one hand, because they don't have to do that. But when they sign and they are committed to it, then it becomes binding to a certain degree, which is some kind of a hardening of these soft instruments. And that's one of the trends we can see nowadays. Then we have finally capacity building, enabling, cooperation, networking. I mean, that's done on a very, very frequently. So cities use these kind of instruments and prefer these kind of instruments. And they are also supported then by regional energy agencies or whatsoever, so also by agencies outside the public administration or local government. We have now discussions on new policy instruments, especially on experimentation and scaling. So that how do you transfer an experiment, a successful experiment from one city to another? I think that's one of the main questions we have to ask nowadays. Then this hardening of soft instruments, carbon budgets is another thing. That's done in Oslo, for example, so that you have carbon budgeting and say, okay, if we don't reach our annual goals, then we have to do more. So it's also binding to a certain degree, but the process as such was voluntary. They didn't have to do it. There was no obligation. And one of the main questions is, of course, funding. How do you find the finances? I mean, all cities in Germany now have plans, they have action plans, they have strategies. Everything is in place. There is some gap still for smaller municipalities and climate adaptation, but what's most important is implementation. And okay, you deal with measurement and monitoring measurement, that's most important nowadays, because we have the strategies. I think there are so many studies still going on the strategies, but I think we should do far more on implementation, which includes monitoring. But it's, of course, difficult to do. And now a couple of sentences related to the organization. When we look at climate policy at the local level, that started usually in environmental agencies and environmental departments. But some of the cities also had or developed specialized climate units, which are often very close to the mayor, the office of the mayor, which has advantages if the mayor is very innovative and wants to do something and supports this unit. But it's a problem if the mayor doesn't do that anymore because it's a new mayor, because then you cannot do anything because you are not even in a department where you can negotiate things, because you are just at the upper level, but you don't have any responsibilities. Then a very important issue is the integration of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Here we have seen different models. So we have seen a full integration model. City of Hamburg has done that, or Rotterdam, but some of them, they also dissolved these units again because it didn't work out. So it's unclear whether you really should integrate mitigation and adaptation in one organizational unit. What you should do is do it at a strategic level. So have an overall strategy for mitigation and adaptation, and you should of course also do it at the operational level when you have a project. It doesn't make any sense to have an EU project on nature-based solutions and another one on climate neutral cities, and they are not connected in any way. So at this program or project level, it is very important to integrate it. And also mainstreaming of climate policy. What I also want to mention here is that, of course, if you cannot do that within an organization, you can reorganize, but if that doesn't work out, there are different other ways to do it. So you have boards with where people from different departments meet on a regular basis, or you can also have a specific procedure that all council decisions need to be checked for their impact on climate policy. So things like that are also done, and organizational innovations are also that you go outside the public administration. It's too hierarchical and you cannot do anything. You found a new unit, which is paid by the city, but which is new and independent. Of course, the question is, can they really govern the public administration? And can they steer something? But there are different organizational models. And I also think monitoring is something like that. How do you do that? Is that an own service company or whatsoever? Or can you integrate that in the hierarchy? Does it make sense or not? But of course, climate mitigation affects many different departments. So it doesn't make any sense to just focus on the environmental agency or the environmental department or on specific issues. And also mobility is another issue. So what we see is often conflicts on the one hand with planning units because they don't work together, and also mobility. So many cities nowadays also started to have a mobility department, but that's usually in another unit. So bring that together, that's most important. Then we also looked at the success factors. So which cities are most successful when it comes to climate policy? Most important factor is size. That's clear. We have clear correlations there. Also the population. So if you have young people or educated people, a growing population, growing cities are much better than shrinking cities. That's for sure. And population is also related to universities. So university cities are among the forerunners always. And economics, of course, if you have more service industry, much better than having an old industrial city, which mining, steel making, things like that, or car making. So that's an indicator for pretty bad for climate policy. Politics, Greens in the administration or Green vice mayor, or also Green council or members in the council, a high percentage of Green party members is also very positive. Infrastructure ownership of utilities is important here. So if you have an own energy utility, that's much better than having huge companies like Vattenfall. Research environment, I mentioned already the university cities. It's important to work with them. So if you have a research center for climate policy like Potsdam has with the PIC, Potsdam Institute for Klimafolgenabschätzung, Potsdam Institute for Climate Change. And that's located in Potsdam, as the name already says. They were involved in all the climate strategies of the city of Potsdam. So that's very positive. Finally, civil society. So if you have strong, active stakeholders, it's much better for climate policy. And what's absolutely clear that smaller cities and towns, they have lower capacities and they need support by regions, national governments, and the EU. And yeah, smaller cities, you also see more changes, discontinuities. So the forerunners are big cities, and there's a lot of past dependencies. A city like Freiburg is still green, and also Berlin at the strategic level, not in the implementation. That's from also related to this study on 104 cities in Germany, and we looked at different types of cities, and we found 6 clusters. And we didn't expect that, but we found 3 different clusters of forerunners. So there are forerunners which can do both climate mitigation and climate adaptation, that are usually the bigger cities. And there are also some smaller cities like Münster. Now we made an update with 190 cities, and Münster is #1 now when it comes to both climate mitigation and adaptation. So we looked at both. But we also found climate mitigation leaders. Among them was Freiburg, which is quite interesting, because Freiburg for a long time didn't do anything or not much on climate adaptation. So they focused fully on climate mitigation. So they were a climate mitigation forerunner, but not a general forerunner. And that has changed now. So with this update of the data, Freiburg is very far ahead again. But we also found climate adaptation leaders, which are cities which were not so innovative at the beginning, but started with a very strong climate adaptation programs. There's Worms, which is a small city, but it's in the Rhine Valley, and it's very hot in summer there, so they really had a problem. And then we found what was to be expected, follower cities, follower cities, more or less, and that's a huge group compared to the others, but also a lot of latecomers and laggards. And when it comes to this update, so many of these latecomers have improved a lot. They are not among the forerunners, but they are among the follower cities now. But there are also cities which don't do anything. It's a small number, but Wolfsburg is one of them, and Wolfsburg is a car maker. So there are some indicators where you can see why cities are develop innovative programs. Here, that's more an idea how this dynamic can work. How can cities improve so they can become better can go from laggard to follower or from follower to a forerunner, but it can also become or develop a poorer climate policy. That's also an option. But from this perspective, we have these types here. So the forerunners usually they stay ahead. The followers may catch up. Then we have also latecomers which step in. We have a case in Finland, which is this Hinku network. They organized mainly smaller municipalities, and they were pretty successful. And then we have also cities, stragglers falling behind and dropouts, which even step out. It's a limited number of cities, but you still find that. And then we have some laggards, nothing happens at all. That's my last point, and then I come to the conclusion. Can make it also pretty quick. I mentioned already scaling, and I think we have to think about different forms and types of scaling. And first type is scaling within cities. So we have a lot of pilot projects, demonstration projects, but they are funded and they are in sites where you can do that, but that's nothing for the whole city. So how do you transfer or scale within a city from a new neighborhood to a neighborhood which is already developed? That's impossible, of course. So you develop, can have a transfer between one neighborhood which is newly built and another one which is newly built. But what do you do with already existing buildings, and which neighborhoods fit together? because you cannot scale or roll out everything over the whole city. So that's one important question. Projectification is a real issue nowadays because you get funding over 3 years or 5 years in maximum. What happens afterwards? This kind of projectification you find very often nowadays. And then scaling beyond cities, that's not really in the debate yet, but I think it's necessary to look at the question, how can you scale beyond the core city? What happens if you merge it with other cities? How do you extend the infrastructure? What does it mean when you need energy from the region, from the surrounding neighborhood or the surrounding region, which might also be more rural and agricultural, but they have to bring in energy, wind farms and things like that. So you have at least to cooperate in a certain way. Or how do you transfer innovation to smaller cities which surround the innovative city? Is that possible or not? So that's a topic which is not discussed at the moment, but should be discussed more often. So I think regional authorities should be more important and become a bigger role. And then the last point, scaling across cities, that's usually debated. So that's this question, how do you transfer it from one city to another? What are these horizontal interactions, and how do you transfer policy innovations, or how do they spread? Transfers from A to B, usually it's an interaction anyway. And which role do these transnational networks play? Nowadays, I think other networks are more important, like regional networks, or also networks of energy and climate managers. They have become more important. And we have functional networks, which could also be regional energy agencies or whatsoever. So there are many challenges. I want to mention only 3 of them. One is you need to strengthen the governance capacities of cities. So that can be strategic, integrated, adaptive. So there are different forms, but the capacity needs to be strengthened. Also, what I mentioned, the hardening of soft instruments is very important. So climate budget, climate contracts, that are new instruments which can be used. Then taking the spatial dimension into account. So I mentioned the regions. You also can see this for the covenant of mayors. So regions are extremely important in this context. Also regional chapters of transnational networks are important. So that's an aspect which has been neglected but needs to be taken into account. And then new forms of scaling. How do you scale experiments? Also matching cities. We try to match different cities. We looked at Turku in Finland, Rostock in Germany, Malmö in Sweden, and Groningen in the Netherlands, because all of them have same size and a very similar structure. Differences between them are, but these kind of cities could be chosen for transfer or for scaling, because it's much easier to have matching cities, and it doesn't make any sense to combine forerunner cities with laggards and latecomers, which never will have the same capacities. Okay, thank you.